Everyone loves a good dinner party, don't they? Filled with laughter, warmth, and the comfort of good company. This story starts with all of that as well. A quaint little gathering among friends. But by the end, no one would be able to recall that warmth without a chill running down their spine. Hello, wanderers of the weird and watchers of the unexplained. Welcome to the Nightside Archive. Tonight's tale is called The Uninvited Dinner Guest. Let's begin. The Petersons were throwing a dinner party in their modest but cozy home on Elm Street. It was a cheerful affair. Mrs. Peterson was a skilled entertainer, and Mr. Peterson was known for his inexhaustible humor. A small group of close-knit friends were invited that evening. The lights from their dining room spilled invitingly onto the shadow-laden street outside, as the group gathered around the table set with polished silverware and Mrs. Peterson's best china. As the roast was being carved and wine glasses filled, the group was interrupted by the sound of a faint knock on the door. At first, no one heard it over the hum of conversation, but the knock grew louder and more persistent. Finally, Mr. Peterson excused himself with a chuckle. "Always someone late to RSVP," he quipped. When Mr. Peterson opened the door, he didn't recognize the person standing on their front porch. A man in his late 40s or early 50s stood there, wearing a long coat that seemed a size too big for him. His face was marked by lines that hinted at years of hardship, his eyes shadowy and sunken. Without waiting for an invitation, the stranger muttered, "Lovely night for a warm meal," and crossed the threshold. Mr. Peterson's initial shock turned into hesitation. After all, it wasn't customary to turn someone away from a warm meal, especially a guest that seemed in need. The mysterious man was ushered inside and introduced to the group as John. Something about John felt immediately off. His interactions were polite, but his smile never quite reached his eyes. He sat at the far end of the table, contributing little to the conversation but observing everything, his gaze intense, as if committing every detail to memory. Despite his odd presence, the Petersons did their best to make the night feel ordinary. As the night unfolded, strange occurrences became harder to ignore. Just as dessert was being served, the flames of the candles flickered violently, dimming the room. John, sitting still as a winterscape, didn't even flinch. "What lovely illumination," he murmured, his voice low like the creak of an old door. But it wasn't just the candles. Plates shifted subtly when no one was touching them. Chairs creaked without weight being applied. A peculiar chill hung in the air surrounding John's place at the table. "Does anyone feel that draft?" asked one guest nervously. Everyone murmured their agreements, except John, who simply raised his glass in mockery of a toast and drank in slow, deliberate sips. As the hour grew later, discomfort gave way to dread. When it was time for guests to leave, John lingered by the doorway, watching each couple bid their goodbyes. Something about the way he stared made their friendly chatter fall silent. One by one, the other guests took their leave, muttering polite remarks about how lovely the evening had been, though none of their faces reflected the warmth of their words. Finally, it was just the Petersons and their uninvited guest. Mrs. Peterson, now visibly uneasy, asked him if he needed help getting back to his home. John looked at her with those unnerving, empty eyes and said, "Why? This is my home." The room fell unbearably silent. Mr. Peterson chuckled nervously, assuming it was some sort of bad joke. "Good one, John," he laughed, trying to lighten the air, But John's expression didn't waver. "I never left," he said plainly. "How long have you been here?" Mr. Peterson asked, his voice trembling. John looked at him coldly. "I arrived long before." The Petersons were baffled. "Long before what?" Mrs. Peterson asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John didn't answer. Instead, he walked to where the candles had burned down to nothing and tilted his head as if listening to something only he could hear. Then, just as suddenly as he'd arrived, he left. Slipping out through the door without a farewell, without a sound, without leaving a trace that he'd ever been there. The next morning, the Petersons chalked it up to an unusual visitor who perhaps had too many drinks or too few wits. But when Mr. Peterson went to open the curtains in the dining room, he screamed. There, etched into the frost of the window pane, were the words, "I never left." Fresh as though carved by a finger that carried frost on its tips. From that day forward, the Petersons couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Doors would creak open at night. Shadows would linger too long at the edges of their vision, and the warm glow of their humble home seemed to dim without reason. Was John merely a wanderer down on his luck? Or was he something else? Something not entirely human? The Petersons moved out of their Elm Street home within the year, and according to the new owners, they sometimes feel as though someone sits at the far end of the dining table when the house is quiet, watching, waiting. So tell me, would you ever open the door to an uninvited dinner guest? Or would you let the knock echo unanswered through the night? Some doors, perhaps, are better left closed, and some guests are better left outside. I'll leave you with that uneasiness bubbling in the pit of your stomach. Sleep tight tonight, dear watchers. But if you hear someone knocking gently on your door, think twice before you answer. Be careful who you let inside, for this, my friends, was the uninvited dinner guest. Sweet dreams, or not.